The first alert didn't come from a spy. It came from a satellite. At precisely 22:13 hours GMT, a KH-11 reconnaissance satellite codenamed Crystal Eye transmitted a burst of encrypted telemetry to a secure ground station in Fort Belvoir, Virginia. The image feed was unremarkable at first glance, an overhead view of dense forest southeast of Minsk. But layered beneath the visual data was the real revelation: thermal and radar overlays captured in multiple bands. Hidden under triple canopy foliage and high-grade Soviet camouflage netting was a column of transporter erector launchers. Not dummies, not decoys. Real SS-20 intermediate-range ballistic missiles, tucked into the tree line, invisible to human sight. Their engine housings radiated residual heat. Their outlines betrayed movement. And they had just been found. Within 30 minutes, the image packet was sitting on a mahogany conference table inside the National Reconnaissance Office. Analysts ran confirmatory filters, multispectral comparison, shadow displacement, synthetic aperture radar passes. Everything matched. These missiles were active, mobile, and they weren't supposed to be there. In Moscow. When a sanitized version of the discovery reached Soviet command via back-channel intelligence, the reaction was disbelief. Impossible. One general barked. They couldn't have seen that. The forest cover was top grade. The camouflage nets were the newest generation treated for thermal diffusion. The movement had occurred at night. No spy planes, no overflights, no electronic intercepts. And yet, the Americans had seen it. More images followed. A buried comms hub in the Carpathians. A concealed radar dish rotated away from satellite vectors. Even a hardened train yard that had been covered by smokescreen during a NATO satellite pass, caught again by a secondary IR scan from a different orbit. Every trick the Soviets relied on: maskirovka, terrain concealment, dummy structures, was being penetrated by something they couldn't counter. Not eyes, not spies, sensors. And these sensors weren't limited by weather, shadow, or even darkness. They fused light, heat, motion, signal. They didn't just see, they understood. Movement patterns, heat signatures, vehicle clusters that didn't match expected energy output. Even the bend in a tent canopy that suggested something heavier hidden underneath. For Soviet commanders, this wasn't just unsettling. It was existential. Because the very thing their strategy depended on, concealment, was being peeled away layer by layer. Not with bombs, not with brute force, but with vision. Artificial vision. They had spent decades building a battlefield doctrine around deception. Now, their enemy could see straight through it. And somewhere in the woods outside Minsk, those missile crews sat in silence, unaware they'd already been found. Inside the Ministry of Defense's granite-walled intelligence center in Moscow, the atmosphere was one of measured confidence. For years, Soviet planners had believed their camouflage doctrine to be unbreakable. The entire philosophy of maskirovka, a blend of misdirection, deception, and concealment, was woven into every corner of military strategy. Tanks disappeared into forests. Missiles hid under movable sheds. Mobile command vehicles parked inside civilian warehouses by day and vanished by night. From satellites, these sites looked like nothing, which is exactly how the Soviets wanted it. PVO commanders routinely dismissed American satellite imagery as crude and limited. They see outlines. One general joked in a closed briefing, but we show them shadows. The prevailing belief was simple: if NATO needed eyes to see, then they would always be constrained by what could be photographed. And the USSR had spent billions ensuring that what needed to be seen wouldn't be. Woodland units deployed thermal diffusing tarps. Bunkers were built into hillsides and designed with uneven surfaces to break up radar reflections. Field manuals were updated to include concealment in non-visible light bands. Entire training regimens revolved around vanishing under tree lines, blending into topography, and managing engine heat. Soviet engineers prided themselves on their camouflage tech. The camouflage netting used on strategic SS-20 mobile launchers was tested against infrared exposure and aerial photography. They believed they'd mastered the battlefield's visibility problem. What no one inside those walls accounted for, what no one truly understood, was that the United States wasn't relying on human eyes anymore. The assumptions were locked into the doctrine. American recon was thought to be predictable overflight patterns, launch orbits, visual timing. A KH-series satellite passed overhead. Soviet units simply paused, waited 15 minutes, moved under cloud cover, or even shifted equipment into hangars with pre-positioned false roof panels. But by the mid-1980s, that entire logic had collapsed. The Americans were no longer dependent on clear skies or open terrain. They weren't just looking, they were scanning, measuring, computing. New generations of sensor technology combining synthetic aperture radar, multispectral imaging, heat flux monitors, and even low-light contrast detection could see motion, energy, and form in combinations the Soviet system didn't even measure. And worse, these systems were networked. An RC-135 flying off Norway could pick up comms movement. A J-STARS orbiting near Turkey could track vehicle clusters. Satellites could compare heat trails from 48 hours earlier. Data fused together in Langley and Cheyenne Mountain produced near real-time profiles of Soviet deployments, including those that were supposed to be invisible. Still, inside the Kremlin's briefing chambers, denial reigned. It was easier to believe in espionage, chance, or manipulated optics. Generals cited anecdotal success stories, a division hidden during a NATO exercise, a fake airfield that drew U.S. attention. What they didn't realize was that the U.S. had let those stories through. Because real visibility wasn't about seeing everything. It was about knowing exactly what mattered. The room full of Soviet war planners armed with outdated assumptions and unquestioned beliefs was about to learn that no amount of doctrine could outmatch an enemy that could see into dimensions they didn't even acknowledge. By the late Cold War, Soviet military doctrine wasn't just tactical, it was spiritual. It was forged in the blood-soaked soil of Kursk, codified in the shadow of NATO, and enforced across every motorized division, missile regiment, and command staff. Above all else, one principle reigned supreme. If they couldn't find you, they couldn't kill you. This was not wishful thinking. It was hard science embedded in Soviet warfighting, a system of deception so dense it extended from camouflaged battalions to entire fake towns built to distract satellites. Maskirovka was more than paint and netting. It was a weaponized illusion. Every deployment came with decoy protocols. Dummy tanks were constructed from wood and inflatable shells. Strategic missiles were moved at night, under concealment tarps, and parked in groves or near civilian infrastructure. Anti-air batteries deployed radar reflectors to simulate larger footprints or absorbed incoming frequencies with specialized mesh. Engineers even mapped out how long tank engines could run before heat signatures became visible from above. Doctrine dictated it down to the minute, and it worked for a time. In exercise after exercise, NATO struggled to map true Soviet positions. American recon photos from the 1970s frequently confused dummies for armor. Tactical air planners expressed frustration over ambiguous target data. The USSR believed it had turned its landmass into a ghost, the largest military machine on Earth, hiding in plain sight. But by the early 1980s, changes were quietly taking root inside U.S. doctrine. Instead of chasing camouflage with better visuals, the Pentagon rewrote the rules of detection itself. New sensor systems began targeting signatures no camouflage could fake: heat dispersal patterns, electromagnetic emissions, Doppler shifts from moving vehicles. Satellites were trained to detect the absence of expected thermal equilibrium in forests, revealing hidden objects not by what they showed, but by what they disrupted. This new model was called pattern subtraction intelligence, where Soviet doctrine relied on adding things to the battlefield to trick the eye. The U.S. removed the noise, looking not for tanks, but for gaps in the terrain's expected behavior: unnatural shadow angles, unexplained heat pools, slight shifts in known ground reflectivity after rainfall. Data from J-STAR's aircraft was layered over satellite passes. Movement was tracked not in bursts, but in trails. Suddenly, Maskirovka didn't just fail, it became a liability. Camouflage netting blocked wind patterns. Dummy tanks gave off no engine vibrations, no power fluctuations, no crew heat. By using deception, Soviet units were revealing themselves as exceptions in a world the Americans had learned to model mathematically. The U.S. was no longer reacting to what the Soviets showed. They were detecting what the Earth should have looked like and flagging every deviation. Within a few years, Soviet field officers noticed it. Missiles that should have remained hidden were targeted in simulations. SAM sites that moved undercover were spotted before they deployed. Bunkers dug deep into hillsides received phantom targeting attention from NATO planners. The doctrine, once built to cloak an empire, was now highlighting it, and the generals who had spent their careers perfecting the art of misdirection were forced to confront an unbearable truth. They weren't hidden. They were being watched by an enemy that no longer cared about their tricks and could see through a battlefield that had, for decades, been protected by illusion. The Soviet missile train moved under complete darkness. It departed from a fortified rail node near Vitebsk at 0127 local time, crawling through tree-lined tracks specifically chosen for their natural concealment. Its cargo 3 RT-21 Temp-2S intercontinental ballistic missiles, scheduled for a rapid redeployment exercise intended to test NATO's response time. No lights, no radar emissions, no known flight paths above. The operation was textbook Soviet doctrine camouflage. Silence, speed, a perfect execution of mobile deterrence. And yet, hours later, the train's exact location appeared in a classified intelligence briefing in Langley, Virginia. The analysts at the CIA didn't just know the route, they had precise timestamps, infrared overlays of the engine bay, and signal degradation patterns from the train's own insulated communication relays. It was the first impossible event, the kind of moment that shatters doctrine. The KH-11 satellite overhead hadn't captured a clear picture of the train's form. It didn't need to. What it recorded instead was the distortion of environmental baselines, the break in thermal uniformity from exhaust heat pooling between pine rows, subtle changes in spectral reflectivity caused by track vibration, even minor electromagnetic fluctuations from onboard generator units powering life support systems. The data was correlated with J-STARS monitoring movements hundreds of kilometers away. Analysts noticed a heat trail that matched no known civilian traffic. Then came the RC-135 ELINT pass picking up short-duration encrypted bursts. Typical of missile convoy status beacons, within 2 hours, what had once been invisible was now catalogued, mapped, and theoretically targeted. In Moscow, when NATO's public-facing reports referenced increased movement of mobile strategic assets in the Vitebsk sector, alarm bells rang. The timing matched the missile train. No public satellite could have seen through that terrain. No spy plane had flown over. Was it leaked? A senior GRU analyst asked. Did they guess? Another speculated. But the truth came in the form of silence. U.S. channels stopped mentioning it. The train arrived at its destination. The exercise was completed. Yet in the intelligence logs from that month, the Americans had quietly upgraded that route's classification from low priority to Tier 1 trackable. The phrase sent shivers through the Soviet intelligence hierarchy. Trackable. In a forest. At night. Without ever being seen. It was the first time the USSR realized that traditional visibility had become irrelevant. The US wasn't using optics. They were sensing presence, measuring terrain disturbance, mapping anomalies in waveform return signatures. And with that, the Soviets' mobile second strike capability, a cornerstone of their nuclear doctrine, had been pierced not by an attack, but by knowledge. This was not a glitch. It wasn't luck. It was the future. And the Soviet generals, who had once mocked America's reliance on satellites, now found themselves scrambling for answers because the forest no longer offered cover. Night no longer brought safety. The missile had stayed hidden from the eye, but not from the sensor. The first internal reports were dismissed as Western disinformation. In the high chambers of Soviet military intelligence, even the idea that the Americans had seen the missile convoy, much less tracked it in real time, was derided as psychological warfare. GRU analysts rolled their eyes. KGB officers scoffed. An official communique circulated claiming the satellite data must have been fabricated, based on intentional leaks by NATO to sow doubt. Let them bluff. One general declared, their optics cannot see through trees. In doctrine briefings, the consensus was firm American satellites were limited by orbit, lighting, and cloud cover. Their systems required perfect alignment. They had to wait for daylight, avoid overcast skies, and be positioned for an overhead pass. The forests of Belarus, Siberia, and Kazakhstan were safe no matter what NATO said. But while the generals refused to accept the implications, mid-level analysts weren't so sure. In quiet corners of the GRU, whispers spread NATO's recent strategic wargames were eerily accurate. Allied air power was being vectored toward previously hidden Soviet staging zones. SAM sites that had never appeared on any NATO maps were suddenly targeted in planning exercises. One particularly chilling instance saw a dummy missile base constructed solely to test American detection limits flagged within 48 hours by U.S. recon. Someone's feeding them coordinates, KGB counterintelligence claimed. The belief was comforting. A mole could be caught, a satellite that sees through camouflage. That was unthinkable. So Moscow began hunting shadows. Security sweeps were ordered, comms logs were purged, dozens of mid-tier officers were interrogated, some reassigned. A GRU colonel was accused of leaking targeting information, even though he had never left his Moscow desk. The reality was too difficult to face. If American sensors could now see what Soviet defenses couldn't hide, then the entire structure of strategic deception was compromised. But the data kept coming. Another convoy. Tracked. A SAM battery relocated at night, detected by thermal spread, a radar array, shut down for maintenance, still marked due to ambient energy residue. And still, Soviet leadership clung to the old truths. Eyes couldn't see in the dark. Camouflage nets worked. Terrain protected. The assumption was so deeply ingrained that confronting the reality meant not just admitting a mistake, it meant acknowledging that an entire generation of military thought had been eclipsed. In desperation, a new theory emerged. NATO was spoofing Soviet command. Maybe they hadn't seen anything, but were pretending to, forcing panic. Reverse maskirovka. The idea gained traction. It gave the generals something to cling to, something to control. Yet, behind closed doors, key figures were no longer so sure. Marshal Akromiev, known for his icy realism, reportedly told a colleague, "If their satellites see heat now, our forests are no longer safe." He ordered a review of mobile deployments. That review never saw daylight. The truth was bleeding into the ranks, slowly, unavoidably. And every time the Americans guessed right again, the disbelief gave way to something worse. Dread. Because if NATO's satellites weren't guessing, if they weren't being fed intel, if they were truly sensing hidden assets from space, then the Cold War battlefield had changed forever. And Moscow wasn't ready. As pressure mounted, Soviet intelligence desperately sought a rational explanation, something that could preserve the illusion of control. They settled on a theory that seemed both plausible and convenient. The Americans had hacked their communications, electronic surveillance, signal theft, a compromised encryption protocol. It made sense, at least on the surface. If NATO was accurately locating missile convoys and staging zones, then perhaps it wasn't a satellite breakthrough at all. Perhaps it was a simple matter of espionage, of Western agencies tapping into Soviet logistics and relaying movement data to their analysts. This belief became policy almost overnight. The KGB launched Operation Signal Dust, a sweeping counterintelligence campaign targeting every division involved in mobile ISEM transit and air defense redeployments. Secure transmission lines were audited. Frequency-hopping protocols were tightened. Engineers were interrogated about possible hardware backdoors. Field units were ordered to go dark, no comms during movement. Not even encrypted bursts. For months, the USSR watched and waited. But the impossible didn't stop. Convoys with zero transmissions were still spotted. New radar sites, constructed in secret under strict comm silence, were located within days. Even mobile nuclear assets that traveled using alternate, previously unused routes were tagged and listed in intercepted NATO target folders. And so, the comms theory began to crack. Because silence wasn't working. And somehow, the quieter the Soviets got, the better the Americans seemed to track them. It wasn't a leak, it wasn't a bug, it wasn't stolen codes, it was something else. A back-channel message from the KGB's liaison office in East Berlin noted something strange. U.S. reconnaissance seemed increasingly indifferent to time of day, weather, or radio patterns. They track things even when we have no EM signature. The report warned. It is as if they are seeing movement itself. That line chilled even the most skeptical minds, because if the Americans weren't relying on intercepted signals or visual imagery, if they were detecting behavior, heat, motion, distortion, then none of the traditional countermeasures mattered. Camouflage was irrelevant. Silence was useless. Encryption was meaningless. Still, the wrong theory persisted in official circles, partly out of fear, partly out of institutional inertia. mostly out of pride. Admitting otherwise would unravel decades of planning. It would mean that the Soviet military, with its vast resources and legendary secrecy, had been systematically outmaneuvered by an invisible opponent. So the files were stamped "Signal Compromise." The protocols were revised. The internal narrative held. And in doing so, Soviet command blinded itself further. They hunted imaginary moles. They changed ciphers hourly. They forced loyal officers into re-education camps for comms discipline breaches, all while U.S. analysts, far from the front lines, pieced together battlefield pictures from heat trails, movement shadows, and radar inconsistencies. The real threat wasn't noise in the wires, it was logic in the machine. A new kind of warfare had begun not with guns or missiles, but with understanding. Understanding how objects disturb their environments, how forests breathe when undisturbed, how the land whispers when heavy vehicles pass by. The Soviets searched for traitors in their ranks. They never realized the traitor was their own doctrine. And by chasing the wrong theory, they guaranteed they'd never find the truth until it was too late. When communications failure couldn't explain the penetrations, and no spies were found to blame, Soviet strategists reached for their next fallback weather-based vulnerability. The Americans, they speculated, must be exploiting moments of rare atmospheric clarity windows when the forest canopy offered less interference, or when infrared readings could be boosted by seasonal variables. A theory emerged that U.S. sensors only worked during periods of low ambient humidity, or when specific thermal conditions aligned just right. It was a comforting illusion. If visibility was only possible under rare circumstances, then Soviet concealment still worked most of the time. The hypothesis became formalized in late 1986 during a classified report titled "Optical Exploitation via Climate Variability," drafted by the Soviet Air Defense Forces. It cited possible environmental distortion layers being bypassed due to temporary thermal corridors exploited by U.S. satellites. In response, orders came down across 3 military districts: adjust movement schedules to avoid suspected visibility windows. Missile convoys were rescheduled. Camouflage netting was redesigned to include moisture-retentive fabrics. Maintenance logs were updated to include temperature readings. Some commanders even resorted to tracking lunar cycles, believing moonlight enhanced satellite detection. And for a short time, results improved. The West's apparent tracking accuracy dipped briefly. Moscow took it as validation. The Americans were weather-bound. Soviet doctrine was intact, merely in need of environmental fine-tuning. But what the generals mistook for a strategic success was merely a pause in data collection. A pause caused by satellite repositioning. Because what they didn't know was that American reconnaissance had just begun transitioning to a new generation of platforms KH-12 satellites, J-STARS wide-area ground surveillance aircraft, and radar systems on stealth drones. These systems didn't rely on optimal skies or perfect angles. They operated with synthetic aperture radar, able to see through cloud cover, tree canopies, and even partial soil layering using micro-wavelength penetrative pulses. The Soviets had built a plan for weather-based concealment against sensors that didn't care about the weather. In fact, the Americans were now running all-weather tracking simulations, fusing data from cloud-penetrating radar, heat diffusion models, and pattern databases. If a truck moved through wet forest soil and changed the heat signature of that ground, U.S. analysts would know. If a radar dish rotated once too many degrees during a downpour, J-stars would flag it as an anomalous signal echo. The reality was worse than the Soviets imagined. It wasn't that NATO had found a visibility window. It was that NATO had eliminated visibility as a constraint entirely. Every Soviet countermeasure now made things easier for the Americans. The heavy moisture-retentive netting used to block IR. It created unnatural cold spots, detectable via thermal mapping. Weather-adjusted movement schedules formed predictable patterns, and reliance on safe weather windows meant entire regiments now clustered activity in the same meteorological windows, creating hotbeds of movement for J-stars and RC-135 aircraft to log and cross-reference. The second wrong theory had done more than fail. It had backfired. And the more the Soviets tried to outmaneuver the Americans using weather, the more they exposed themselves to a battlefield they didn't even see coming. A battlefield shaped not by fog, but by algorithms. What the USSR called weather, the United States called input variables. And by the time the Kremlin realized it, the game had already shifted from camouflage to code. By the end of 1987, the Soviet General Staff faced an intelligence paradox it couldn't explain. On one hand, NATO's operational tempo remained consistent. No mass deployments, no new doctrines on paper, no radical technological revelations in public view. But on the battlefield, especially in simulated or proxy engagements, something had changed. Western forces were striking deeper, faster, and more precisely. American airstrikes in Libya, recon runs near East Germany, and even naval exercises in the Barents Sea revealed a chilling pattern the US and its allies knew exactly where to hit and exactly when Soviet units would be vulnerable. At first, Soviet planners blamed internal leaks, then atmospheric anomalies, and finally weather-based exposure. But nothing held up. Behind closed doors, deep within the KGB's first directorate, a new theory began to form, one that terrified even the most cynical minds. The Americans had built a battlefield intelligence machine that didn't need to spy. Instead, it sensed, fused data, predicted. This wasn't just about satellites, it was about systems that understood motion, energy, and terrain itself. Systems that could correlate an ICBM trailer's engine pulse with ground compression patterns seen from orbit. That could match infrared signatures from deep space with EM echoes from airborne radar. That could triangulate shadow inconsistencies from surveillance drones with missing thermal equilibrium along a ridgeline. And that system wasn't theoretical. It was real. The name began surfacing in intercepted NATO communications all-source fusion. The term was harmless enough, but what it represented was revolutionary. Unlike the Soviet model where satellite data, radio intercepts, and human intelligence were compartmentalized, U.S. intelligence agencies had begun fusing everything in near real time. A satellite saw heat. An RC-135 caught a signal burst. A J-stars detected ground vibration. A U-2 camera noticed tire marks. All that data was fed into a central processing hub, cross-verified, modeled, and extrapolated. Suddenly, Soviet secrets weren't being exposed, they were being calculated. Entire missile movements predicted from fuel truck appearances. Radar realignments inferred from cloud-based microwave scattering. Convoy destinations deduced from tree canopy disturbance days earlier. The Soviet intelligence apparatus was never designed for this kind of threat. They believed in physical concealment. America had shifted to mathematical revelation. One GRU analyst described it as an opponent who doesn't see what we show, but sees what we disrupt. A colonel at the Baikonur Cosmodrome warned that the Americans were mapping patterns over time, not snapshots, but full-motion prediction grids. But when those concerns reached the Kremlin, they were buried. The truth was too disruptive. If the Americans had built a machine that could detect motion from space, if they could predict Soviet behavior before it happened, then no missile was safe, no bunker was hidden, no deception could hold. This wasn't an intelligence breach, it was an intelligence extinction event. Because the Soviets hadn't been hacked, they hadn't been watched, they had been understood. And in a war of understanding versus tradition, understanding wins every time. The revolution didn't happen on a battlefield. It happened in a dimly lit operations center 60 feet underground in Virginia, where U.S. Air Force technicians, NSA signal analysts, and CIA imagery experts sat in front of glowing terminals, feeding thousands of disparate inputs into a machine that didn't care about rank, origin, or classification. This was the true American system, not a satellite, not a drone, not a spy plane, but a fusion engine of data, engineered to convert invisible traces into tactical dominance. At its heart was a principle no Soviet officer had ever dared to imagine: total visibility through total integration. And it worked like this. A J.S. Stars aircraft flying over West Germany detects an unusual ripple of ground movement in a forest corridor. At the same moment, a KH-12 satellite passes overhead and notes an aberration in canopy structure, small but consistent with convoy traffic. Hours later, an RC-135 picks up a brief, narrow-band signal burst. It's encrypted, short, meaningless in isolation, but not to the fusion system. Each data point is logged and cross-referenced. The movement ripple matches known Soviet trailer behavior under wet soil. The satellite shadow deviation fits the footprint of an RT-21 missile transport. The signal burst aligns with an operational check-in ping used by field command units in the 27th Guards Rocket Army. Within minutes, a digital overlay marks the location as probable mobile ICBM convoy. Within an hour, it becomes confirmed movement, Tier 1 target. And by sunrise, B-52s, 300 miles away, receive a flight plan that would place cruise missiles in that exact corridor. The system doesn't stop. It maps trails, backtracks movements, predicts future destinations based on previous terrain preferences. It even assigns signature deviation scores a probability index of concealment quality, factoring in foliage density, vehicle engine class, and seasonal thermal norms. To the Soviet Union, such a capability was mythological. To the United States, it had a name: Sentinel Grid. Declassified only in part decades later, the Sentinel Grid was a software framework born from early AI models, fed by reconnaissance databases dating back to the 1960s. It used recursive modeling to predict how objects should behave in certain environments and flagged anomalies with laser precision. This was not just surveillance, it was machine-forged insight. Where Soviet reconnaissance asked, "What can we see?" the U.S. Wonhu system asked, "What should be there and when something wasn't right?" It sounded the alarm. No radar ping, no problem. No thermal bloom, irrelevant. If the pattern broke, the machine noticed. That's why the Soviets kept failing to understand how the Americans knew. They were searching for leaks and traitors. They were looking for what NATO had seen. They never realized the U.S. wasn't looking at them. It was looking around them, and noticing every echo that didn't belong. The sentinel grid turned silence into signal, stillness into movement, camouflage into betrayal. And because it operated on data, not doctrine, it improved with every engagement. Every convoy spotted made the next easier. Every deception failed taught it how to spot new ones. It was alive, not conscious, but predictive. And it didn't care about ideology, borders, or steel, only logic. And in a war where one side relied on hiding, this machine made hiding impossible. It wasn't declared. It wasn't televised. But every Soviet officer who reviewed the after-action reports knew what had happened. The Americans had won a battle without firing a shot, because the victory lay not in destruction, but in revelation. It began during a 1988 Warsaw Pact war game in Ukraine, codenamed Shield of Dawn. It was a massive multi-division exercise, simulating a sudden escalation along the Central European front. Soviet forces deployed everything mobile missile convoys, layered SAM networks, electronic jamming squadrons, and deepfake radar installations meant to mislead enemy sensors. The goal was to test how long they could remain invisible. The result was humiliation. Because 5 hours into the operation, NATO forces not officially participating, but clearly observing, released a response simulation summary to Allied partners. That document, intentionally leaked by West German defense contacts, listed every major Soviet deployment location, matched down to the hour of movement. It showed precise thermal trail decay patterns from missile trucks. It identified decoy radar sites by their unnatural EM frequency drift. It even noted exact relocation coordinates of mobile command posts before those units had even reported arrival internally. The Soviet general in charge of the exercise, Colonel General Alexei S. Berdyansky, reportedly read the summary in stunned silence before declaring, "We weren't just seen, we were mapped." His next order was a full shutdown of the game. The blow was not tactical. It was existential. If an unarmed intelligence machine could dissect the full breadth of a Soviet mobilization, if it could distinguish real from fake, anticipate decoy patterns, and predict logistics flow, then the core of Soviet doctrine was in ruins. Because Soviet military strategy had always relied on maskirovka, masking, misdirection, and misperception. But now, maskirovka was failing. The more they tried to hide, the more the Americans learned. The humiliation deepened when a second NATO brief, presented quietly at a summit in Brussels, included a full topographical model of Soviet underground storage sites in Belarus, right down to moisture displacement patterns traced from aerial sensors. That report hadn't been compiled from spies. It had come from signal shadows, from heat ghosts, from absence of movement where movement should have occurred. The Americans weren't seeing Soviet assets. They were seeing the holes those assets left in the environment, and there was no countermeasure for that. The Soviet response, total doctrinal lockdown. Strategic mobility operations were frozen. A new camouflage division was formed. Internal reviews demanded redesigns of vehicle exhaust systems, netting materials, and even soil compression spreaders. But it was too late. Because the battlefield had changed. Not through invasion, not through bombing, but through humiliation data-induced, algorithmically achieved, and globally known. One NATO officer, when asked about the victory, summed it up simply. They kept trying to hide from eyes. We weren't using eyes. For the Soviets, this wasn't just a defeat. It was a mirror held up to an empire that no longer understood how war was being fought. And when they looked into it, what they saw wasn't the enemy. It was their own blindness. It wasn't a bomb that cracked the Soviet defense doctrine. It was a quiet realization spreading like a virus through the halls of military academies, intelligence offices, and war rooms. If you can't hide, you can't win. And the USSR had built its entire Cold War strategy on hiding. From the vast forests of Eastern Europe to the underground bunkers in the Urals, the Soviet Union had invested billions in being unseen. Camouflage divisions, mobile ICBM railways, decoy airfields, hardened bunkers, fake heat sources, inflatable tanks, all designed to confuse, mislead, and disappear from the enemy's view. But now, that view was omnipresent. It didn't come from human eyes. It came from pattern recognition, thermal signatures, micro-movements, and machine learning long before the term became common. In private briefings, senior planners in the general staff admitted what they couldn't say aloud. We've been preparing for the wrong kind of war. It wasn't just tactical systems that collapsed, it was the ideology itself. Soviet supremacy was based on the belief that it could control its own narrative, stage its own battlefield, and choose when and how to be seen. But in this new theater of war, you didn't choose visibility, the system chose you. A grainy photograph from an American satellite wasn't just an image anymore. It was evidence. Evidence that every movement, every deployment, every deception could be broken down into mathematical footprints, traceable by an intelligence network that saw the landscape as a living document. By the early months of 1989, whispers of this realization were turning into policy paralysis. Soviet missile field commanders began delaying deployments for fear of being tracked. SAM crews refused to reposition without updated counter-detection protocols. Even Politburo defense briefings took on a darker tone, less confidence, more uncertainty. Marshal Yazov, the Soviet defense minister, issued a classified directive calling for a total reevaluation of environmental surveillance, vulnerability across all strategic branches. It was a last-ditch effort to identify how deep the exposure went. The answer: too deep. From temperature-induced radar lag to foliage disruption caused by tank columns days earlier, everything left a trace. And the Americans weren't just gathering these traces, they were predicting the next ones. This wasn't a war of bullets anymore. It was a war of inference, of intelligence parity shattered, of secrets undone by science. And it killed the myth of Soviet invisibility one satellite sweep at a time. Ideologically, this collapse ran deeper than doctrine. It infected the very psyche of the Soviet command structure. For decades, they had believed in outsmarting the enemy through misdirection. But now, the enemy had stopped guessing. The Americans no longer had to play catch-up. They had flipped the game board. And for the USSR, built on shadows and steel, there was only one terrifying conclusion left. They had already lost a war they didn't even see starting. Today, the satellites orbit higher, the sensors grow sharper, the data streams faster. But the ghost of what happened in the late 1980s still lingers in every strategy room, every war game simulation, every defense budget line with the word fusion in it. The Soviets never recovered. Not from a missile strike, not from a coup, but from being seen. The fall of the Soviet Union is often blamed on economics, ideology, or political stagnation. But in the corridors of Western intelligence, where the truth is quieter, colder, and more precise, there's another explanation. They lost the war of visibility. Because what began with a few intercepted heat trails and shadow inconsistencies evolved into something far greater, a doctrine built on knowing more, sooner, and with higher certainty than the opponent believed possible. The U.S. didn't just win with stealth aircraft, superior jets, or high-tech satellites. It won with a system that saw before it aimed. It didn't need to guess. It didn't need to bluff. It just needed to watch long enough, and the enemy would reveal themselves. Today, remnants of that era still orbit the Earth. Some are defunct satellites. Some are sensor protocols now embedded in AI defense networks. And some are strategic principles lessons from a war that was never declared but deeply, irreversibly lost. A war where movement was a mistake, where silence was a signal, and where hiding meant nothing. The Soviet Union is gone. But every modern military force, China, Iran, North Korea, studies that collapse with growing unease. Because in the age of multi-domain operations, synthetic aperture radar, and predictive modeling, the same lesson applies. There is no such thing as invisible, only unprocessed. And the side with the better processor wins.